In the rise of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII secured the throne and married Elizabeth of York to unite York and Lancaster, but the story of their children is less familiar. Some became rulers, others died young, and their fates shaped the future of England and Scotland. Join us as we trace the lives of Arthur, Margaret, Henry, Elizabeth, Mary, Edmund, and Katherine, what they did, who they married, and how their legacies echoed through history. By the end, you'll know not just what happened to each child, but how they fit into the Tudor story. We'll examine each child in birth order, following their lives from birth through upbringing, marriages, and ultimate fates. From the eldest heir who died too soon to the babies who barely drew breath, each played a role in Henry VII's grand design for dynasty. Let's begin with the eldest, Arthur. Arthur Tudor was born on September 20th, 1486, at Winchester Castle, just over a year after his father's victory at Bosworth Field. Henry VII deliberately chose Winchester for the birth, believing it to be the legendary seat of King Arthur's Camelot. The name Arthur was no accident. Henry VII sought to invoke the mystical authority of the legendary king to legitimize his new dynasty. As the firstborn son of a usurper king, Arthur's very existence was crucial to Henry VII's claim to the throne. The prince's birth represented the union of York and Lancaster, the supposed end of the Wars of the Roses, and the hope for a stable succession that had eluded England for decades. Arthur received the finest education befitting a future king. He was taught Latin, Greek, and French, as well as history, theology, and mathematics. His tutors included some of the finest scholars of the day, reflecting Henry VII's understanding that a Renaissance prince needed intellectual as well as political preparation. From an early age, Arthur was groomed for kingship. He was invested as Prince of Wales at Frogmore on November 29, 1489, when he was just 3 years old. This ceremony, held with great pomp at Westminster Abbey, marked his formal recognition as heir to the throne and Duke of Cornwall. As heir apparent, Arthur's role was largely ceremonial and educational during his youth. However, his marriage became central to Henry VII's foreign policy. In 1489, when Arthur was barely 3, he was betrothed to Katherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. This alliance promised to legitimize the Tudor dynasty through association with established European royalty. The marriage negotiations dragged on for years, with both sides using the betrothal as a diplomatic tool. Arthur's value as a marriage prospect grew as Henry VII's reign stabilized and it became clear the Tudor dynasty would endure. Arthur married Katherine of Aragon on November 14, 1501, at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. He was 15, she was nearly 16. The wedding was a magnificent affair, designed to showcase the wealth and stability of the Tudor court to European observers. Following the wedding, Arthur and Katherine were sent to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, where Arthur was to learn the practical aspects of governance as President of the Council of Wales. This was intended as his apprenticeship in kingship, preparing him for eventual rule over England. Henry VII invested enormous hopes in Arthur. The prince represented everything the king had fought for: dynastic legitimacy, European recognition, and domestic stability. Arthur's education and marriage were carefully orchestrated to fulfill Henry VII's vision of a powerful Tudor monarchy. Contemporary sources suggest Henry VII was deeply involved in Arthur's upbringing, viewing his eldest son as the culmination of his dynastic ambitions. The king's correspondence reveals a father who saw Arthur not just as his heir, but as vindication of his claim to the throne. Tragedy struck in April 1502. Arthur fell ill at Ludlow Castle and died on April 2, 1502, at the age of 15. The exact cause of death remains unknown, though contemporary accounts suggest a sudden illness, possibly influenza or plague. Arthur's death devastated Henry VII. VII's carefully laid plans. The king had invested heavily in his eldest son's preparation for kingship, and Arthur's death forced a complete recalibration of succession strategy. The marriage alliance with Spain was thrown into uncertainty, with Katherine's status becoming a diplomatic crisis. Arthur was buried in Worcester Cathedral, where his tomb remains today. His death marked the end of Henry VII's original dynastic vision and thrust his younger brother Henry into the role of heir, a position that would ultimately lead to Henry VIII's tumultuous reign. Arthur's brief life and early death set in motion the events that would define Tudor history for the next century. Margaret Tudor was born on November 28, 1489, at Westminster Palace, the second child and eldest daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. From birth, Margaret's destiny was international diplomacy. As a royal daughter, her primary value lay in the marriage alliance she could secure for England. Named after Lady Margaret Beaufort, her formidable paternal grandmother, Margaret Tudor inherited both the Tudor ambition and the strong will that would characterize her entire life. Margaret received an education appropriate for a Tudor princess, though less extensive than that given to her brothers. She learned Latin, French, music, dancing, and needlework. More importantly, she was trained in the diplomatic skills she would need as a queen in a foreign court. From early childhood, Margaret was aware that her marriage would serve England's diplomatic interests. Henry VII began considering potential alliances for his daughter when she was still very young, viewing her as a crucial piece in his foreign policy strategy. In 1502, Henry VII negotiated Margaret's betrothal to James IV of Scotland. This alliance represented a dramatic shift in Anglo-Scottish relations and was part of Henry VII's broader strategy to secure England's borders through diplomacy rather than warfare. The marriage treaty, signed in 1502, was controversial in England, where Scotland was traditionally viewed as an enemy. However, Henry VII saw the alliance as a way to neutralize the Scottish threat and potentially bring Scotland into England's sphere of influence. Margaret married James IV at Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh on August 8, 1503, when she was 13 years old. The wedding was magnificent, designed to cement the new alliance between the two kingdoms. As Queen of Scotland, Margaret adapted to Scottish court life and bore James IV several children, though only one, the future James V, survived to adulthood. Her marriage initially strengthened the alliance between England and Scotland, fulfilling Henry VII's diplomatic objectives. Margaret's most significant political role came after James IV's death at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. As mother of the infant James V, she became Regent of Scotland, wielding real political power for the first time in her life. However, her regency was complicated by her remarriage to Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, in 1514. This marriage, undertaken without consent from either the Scottish nobles or her brother Henry VIII, cost her the regency and created years of political turmoil. Margaret's most lasting contribution was her children. Her son James V would father Mary, Queen of Scots, and through this line, Margaret became the ancestor of the Stuart dynasty that would eventually inherit the English throne. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, he united the crowns through his descent from Margaret Tudor. In this way, Henry VII's diplomatic marriage eventually achieved the union of the kingdoms he had envisioned. Henry VII viewed Margaret primarily as a diplomatic asset, but contemporary sources suggest genuine paternal affection. Her marriage to James IV represented one of his greatest diplomatic triumphs, temporarily ending centuries of Anglo-Scottish warfare. The king's correspondence with Margaret shows his satisfaction with the Scottish alliance and his hopes that her children would cement the relationship between the kingdoms. Margaret Tudor died on October 18, 1541, at Methven Castle in Scotland. She had lived through the reigns of her father, brother, and nephew, adapting to dramatic changes in both kingdoms. Her legacy proved more significant than perhaps anyone anticipated. While her father saw her marriage as a diplomatic necessity, Margaret's descendants ultimately inherited both the Scottish and English thrones. Through her line, Henry VII's vision of united British kingdoms was finally realized, though not in the way he had imagined. Margaret Tudor embodied the international nature of Tudor diplomacy, and her story demonstrates how royal marriages could have consequences spanning generations. Henry Tudor, the future Henry VIII, was born on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace. As the second son, Henry was initially known as the Duke of York and was never expected to inherit the throne. His early years were spent in the shadow of his older brother Arthur, who was being prepared for kingship. Henry's birth secured the succession for Henry VII, providing a crucial spare heir in an age of high infant mortality. However, as the younger son, his upbringing differed significantly from Arthur's more formal preparation for rule. Henry received an exceptional education, arguably superior to that of many future kings. Since he was not expected to rule, his education was broader and more humanistic than Arthur's more practical preparation for governance. He was taught by leading scholars, including John Skelton and later Erasmus. Henry became fluent in Latin, French, and Spanish, studied theology, mathematics, and music. He also excelled in physical pursuits, dancing, hunting, jousting, and tennis. This Renaissance prince education would profoundly shape his later kingship. Unlike Arthur, who was sent to Ludlow to learn governance, Henry remained at court, where he could observe the workings of royal administration firsthand while pursuing his scholarly and athletic interests. Arthur's death in April 1502 transformed Henry's life completely. At age 10, he suddenly became heir to the throne, though he would not be formally invested as Prince of Wales until 1504. This delay reflected Henry VII's caution and perhaps his continued grief over Arthur's death. The transition from spare to heir required adjustments to Henry's education and preparation. However, his father kept him closely supervised at court rather than sending him to Wales as Arthur had been sent. This may have reflected Henry VII's desire to maintain tight control over his remaining heir. The relationship between Henry VII and his surviving son was complex. Contemporary sources suggest Henry VII became increasingly protective and controlling of Henry after Arthur's death, keeping him close to court and limiting his independence. Henry VII's later years were marked by increasing paranoia and avarice, traits that affected his relationship with his heir. The king seems to have viewed Henry as both precious and potentially dangerous, the only guarantee of dynastic continuation, but also a potential focus for opposition. Henry's later actions as king suggest he may have resented his father's restrictive oversight and financial parsimony. The dramatic policy reversals that mark the early years of Henry VIII's reign can be seen partly as rebellion against his father's methods. Henry became king on April 21, 1509, following his father's death. At 17, he was young, athletic, charismatic, and eager to distinguish himself from his father's cautious, economical approach to kingship. His accession was celebrated throughout England. Unlike his father, who had won the throne through conquest, Henry VIII inherited it legitimately and faced no immediate threats to his authority. This security allowed him to pursue more aggressive and expensive policies than his father had dared. One of Henry's first acts was to marry Katherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, in a move that combined personal inclination with diplomatic necessity. This marriage would later become central to Henry's break with Rome, but initially it fulfilled his father's Spanish alliance. While Henry VIII's reign would span 38 years and transform England, his early actions were heavily influenced by his inheritance from Henry VII. He inherited a stable kingdom, a full treasury, and a functioning administrative system that his father had painstakingly constructed. However, Henry quickly abandoned his father's cautious foreign policy, pursuing expensive wars in France and ambitious diplomatic schemes that drained the treasury Henry VII had accumulated. This suggests a fundamental difference in temperament and approach between father and son. Henry's obsession with securing the succession reflected lessons learned from his father's experience. Henry VII had seen how precarious dynastic continuity could be, and Henry VIII became increasingly desperate to secure male heirs as his reign progressed. The king's 6 marriages and his break with Rome over his divorce from Katherine of Aragon can be understood partly as responses to the dynastic insecurity his father had overcome but never forgotten. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, having transformed England from a relatively minor European kingdom into a major power and established the Church of England. However, his reign also demonstrated the dangers of the absolute monarchy his father had established. In many ways, Henry VIII's reign vindicated Henry VII's careful dynastic planning while also revealing its limitations. Henry VII had secured the Tudor succession, but he could not control how his heir would use the power he inherited. Henry VIII's legacy was shaped by both his father's achievements and his rebellion against his father's methods. The Renaissance prince became a Renaissance tyrant, but he remained fundamentally his father's son in his understanding of royal power and dynastic necessity. Elizabeth Tudor was born on July 2, 1492 at Sheen Palace, later Richmond Palace, the fourth child and second daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Her birth followed closely after her brother Henry's arrival the previous year, suggesting the royal couple's confidence in the dynasty's growing stability. As the second daughter, Elizabeth's birth was welcomed but did not carry the diplomatic significance of her older sister Margaret. However, in an age of high infant mortality, every royal child represented both hope and insurance for the dynasty's continuation. Elizabeth Tudor's life was tragically brief. She died on September 14, 1495, at the age of 3 years and 2 months. The exact cause of her death is not recorded in surviving documents, though infant mortality from disease was common even among the royal family. Her death occurred during a period when Henry VII's reign was still consolidating. The king faced ongoing threats from Yorkist pretenders, and the loss of a child, while not uncommon, represented a reduction in the dynasty's prospects for the future. Elizabeth's death came at a particularly challenging time for the royal family. Her father was still establishing his authority, and every child represented both a diplomatic asset and insurance for the succession. The loss of a daughter reduced Henry VII's options for future marriage alliances. For Elizabeth of York, the loss of a daughter would have been deeply personal. Contemporary sources suggest that royal mothers formed strong bonds with their children despite the formal arrangements of royal nurseries and households. As a young daughter, Elizabeth Tudor's relationship with her father would have been limited by both her age and the formal structure of royal households. However, her death would have reminded Henry VII of the fragility of dynastic planning and the uncertainty that shadowed even established royal families. Henry VII's meticulous financial records show expenses for Elizabeth's funeral, indicating that she received appropriate honors despite her young age. This attention to ceremonial detail reflects the king's understanding that even brief royal lives had public significance. Elizabeth Tudor was buried at Westminster Abbey, where she rests among other royal children who died young. Her brief life serves as a reminder of the human cost of dynastical ambition and the uncertainty that faced all families, royal or otherwise, in the late medieval period. While Elizabeth Tudor left no direct legacy through marriage or descendants, her death was part of the broader pattern of loss that shaped Henry VII's later reign. The king's increasing caution and his protective attitude toward his surviving children may have been influenced by losses like Elizabeth's death. Her story, though brief, illustrates the vulnerability that underlied even the most carefully planned dynastic strategies. In an age before modern medicine, royal children were as susceptible to death as any others, making each survival a blessing and each loss a reminder of mortality's power over human ambition. Mary Tudor was born on March 18, 1496, at Richmond Palace, the fifth child and third daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Named after the Virgin Mary, she was born during a period of increasing stability for the Tudor dynasty, when her father's hold on the throne was becoming more secure. As the youngest daughter, Mary's early years were spent at court, where she received the education and training appropriate for a Tudor princess. Her beauty and charm were noted from an early age, marking her as a valuable asset in her father's diplomatic strategies. Mary received an excellent education befitting her royal status. She learned Latin, French, music, and dancing, skills that would serve her well in her future roles as queen and duchess. Her education emphasized the accomplishments expected of a Renaissance princess. Contemporary accounts describe Mary as exceptionally beautiful, charming, and intelligent. These qualities, combined with her royal blood, made her one of the most desirable marriage prospects in Europe during her teenage years. Mary's first major role came through her marriage to Louis XII of France on October 9, 1514. She was 18. He was 52 and in poor health. This marriage alliance was negotiated by her brother Henry VIII as part of his complex European diplomacy. As Queen of France, Mary's reign was brief but significant. Louis XII died on January 1, 1515, just 3 months after their marriage, leaving Mary a widow at 19. However, her brief queenship enhanced her status and made her an even more valuable diplomatic asset. During her short time as queen, Mary adapted well to French court life and reportedly charmed the French nobility. Her widowhood, however, created complications for Anglo-French relations and her own future. Against her brother's wishes and diplomatic interests, Mary secretly married Charles Brandon, 1st Duke of Suffolk, In France in early 1515, Brandon was Henry VIII's close friend, but far below Mary's royal status, making this a scandalous love match. This marriage created a serious diplomatic crisis. Henry VIII was furious at the unauthorized marriage, which destroyed his plans for using Mary's availability to secure new alliances. The couple faced potential exile or worse upon their return to England. Eventually, Henry VIII forgave his sister and brother-in-law, though they were required to pay substantial fines and forfeit some of Mary's French dower. This incident demonstrated both Mary's strong will and the limits of royal family loyalty. Mary and Charles Brandon had several children, most notably Frances Brandon, who became the mother of Lady Jane Grey. Through this line, Mary Tudor became grandmother to the nine days queen, who briefly held the English throne in 1553. Frances Brandon's marriage to Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset, was part of the Protestant faction's attempts to influence the succession during the later Tudor period. Mary's descendants thus became involved in the religious and political conflicts that characterized mid-16th century England. Mary's relationship with her father Henry VII was typical of royal daughters, affectionate but subordinated to diplomatic necessity. Henry VII saw her marriage as crucial to his foreign policy, though he died before her marriage to Louis XII was arranged. Her relationship with her brother Henry VIII was more complex. Initially close, it was strained by her unauthorized second marriage, but later repaired. Henry VIII valued Mary's counsel and maintained correspondence with her throughout her life. Mary's influence with Henry VIII was particularly notable during the later years of his reign, when family ties became increasingly important to the aging king. Her Protestant sympathies may have influenced Henry's religious policies. As Duchess of Suffolk, Mary lived a relatively quiet life at court and on her estates. She remained an important figure in English society and was consulted on various matters by her brother the king. Her later years were marked by increasing religious conviction. Mary became a committed Protestant and was influential in promoting Reformed religion at court and in her household. Mary Tudor died on June 25, 1533, at Westhorpe Hall in Suffolk, at the age of 37. Her death preceded many of the most dramatic events of Henry VIII's later reign, including his marriage to Anne Boleyn and the break with Rome. Mary's legacy lived on through her descendants, particularly through her daughter Frances and granddaughter Lady Jane Grey. Her willingness to marry for love rather than diplomatic advantage also set a precedent that influenced later royal marriages. She represents a Tudor princess who successfully navigated the competing demands of duty and personal desire, achieving both royal status and personal happiness while maintaining her family relationships and religious convictions. Edmund Tudor was born on February 21, 1499, at Greenwich Palace, the sixth child and third son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. His birth came during a period of relative stability for the Tudor dynasty, when his father's reign was well established and secure. Named possibly after his father's half-brother Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, the infant prince represented continued dynastic security for Henry VII. As a third son, Edmund provided additional insurance for the succession, though he was far from the throne in terms of inheritance. Edmund was granted the title Duke of Somerset shortly after his birth, reflecting his father's practice of honoring his sons with significant titles even in infancy. This dukedom had historical significance, having been held by members of the Beaufort family, Henry VII's maternal relatives. As an infant duke, Edmund would have had his own household establishment, governed by carefully chosen nobles and servants who would have been responsible for his care and early education. However, his life was too brief for any real preparation for a significant role in government or diplomacy. Edmund's birth occurred during what seemed to be a golden period for Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. The king's reign was secure, the treasury was growing, and the royal couple had successfully produced several healthy children who were beginning to fulfill their diplomatic and dynastic purposes. The infant prince would have been part of the elaborate ceremonial life of the Tudor court, appearing at significant occasions as appropriate for his age and status. However, royal infants in this period lived largely separate from their parents, cared for by professional wet nurses and household staff. As with his other very young children, Henry VII's relationship with Edmund would have been formal and limited. Royal fathers of this period typically had little direct involvement in infant care, though they remained ultimately responsible for their children's welfare and future prospects. Henry VII, His meticulous financial records show careful attention to the costs of maintaining Edmund's household, indicating that the king took his responsibilities as a father seriously, even when his children were too young for direct interaction. Edmund Tudor died on June 19, 1500, at the age of 16 months. Like many of his siblings, the exact cause of death is not recorded, though infant mortality from disease was tragically common even among the royal family. Despite his young age, Edmund received a state funeral befitting a Duke of Somerset and son of the king. He was buried at Westminster Abbey in what is now known as the Innocents' Corner, where several royal children who died young are interred. Henry VII's accounts show significant expenditure on Edmund's funeral, reflecting both genuine grief and the political necessity of demonstrating royal dignity even in the face of personal loss. While Edmund Tudor's life was too brief to create any direct historical impact, his death was part of the pattern of infant mortality that shaped Henry VII's later reign and policies. Each loss reminded the king of the fragility of dynastic planning. Edmund's death, coming so soon after his sister Elizabeth's death in 1495, may have contributed to Henry VII's increasing caution and his protective attitude toward his surviving children. The king understood that every child lost reduced his options for future alliances and succession planning. Edmund Tudor's brief life serves as a poignant reminder of the human reality behind dynastic ambition. Despite all the ceremony, titles, and careful planning that surrounded royal births, princes and princesses remained as vulnerable to death as any other children. His story illustrates the precarious nature of succession planning in the pre-modern era, when even the most powerful families could see their carefully laid plans disrupted by forces beyond their control. Edmund's death was a personal tragedy for his parents and a practical reminder of the uncertainties that faced all dynastic planners. In the broader context of Henry VII's children, Edmund represents both the hope that came with each royal birth and the sorrow that too often followed when those hopes were cut short by mortality. Katherine Tudor was born on February 2, 1503, at the Tower of London, the seventh and final child of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Her birth came at a particularly poignant moment in the royal family's history, occurring in the same year as her brother Arthur's death and her sister Margaret's departure for Scotland. The choice of the Tower of London for Catherine's birth was significant. While the Tower served as a royal residence as well as a fortress and prison, by 1503 it was less commonly used for royal births. This location may have been chosen for security reasons or simply because the court was residing there at the time. Catherine's birth was overshadowed by tragedy. Her mother, Elizabeth of York, had already endured the loss of 2 children and the trauma of Arthur's unexpected death just months earlier. The Queen was now 37 years old, considered quite mature for childbearing in the early 16th century. The royal family was still adjusting to the massive disruption caused by Arthur's death, which had thrown succession plans into chaos and created a diplomatic crisis over Catherine of Aragon's status. Into this atmosphere of grief and uncertainty, Katherine Tudor was born. Katherine Tudor's life lasted only a few days. She died on February 18, 1503, just 16 days after her birth. The exact cause of her death is not recorded, though infant mortality in the first weeks of life was tragically common, even among the royal family. Her brief life coincided with her mother's final illness. Elizabeth of York had never fully recovered from Catherine's birth and died on February 11, 1503, 7 days before her infant daughter. Mother and daughter thus died within a week of each other, dealing Henry VII a devastating double blow. Elizabeth of York's death so soon after Catherine's birth suggests that the Queen may have suffered complications from childbirth. Medieval and early modern medical understanding was limited, and puerperal fever and other postpartum complications were often fatal. The Queen's death devastated Henry VII, who by all accounts had enjoyed a happy marriage despite its political origins. Elizabeth's death left the king not only grieving, but also facing the prospect of ruling alone after 18 years of partnership. Catherine's death, following so closely after her mother's, marked the end of Henry VII's family life as he had known it. The king was left with 4 surviving children and no prospect of remarrying to produce additional heirs or diplomatic alliances. Contemporary accounts suggest that Henry VII never fully recovered from the loss of his wife and infant daughter. The king became increasingly reclusive, suspicious, and avaricious in his later years, characteristics that may have been influenced by his personal losses. Katherine Tudor was buried at Westminster Abbey, likely in the same tomb or area as her mother Elizabeth of York. The infant princess received appropriate royal honors despite her brief life, reflecting the importance attached to even the shortest royal lives. Her burial alongside her mother symbolized the tragic end of Henry VII's family happiness and the beginning of his lonely final years as a widower, king ruling without the partner who had helped legitimize his dynasty. While Katherine Tudor's life was too brief to have any direct historical impact, her death marked a crucial turning point in Henry VII's reign. The loss of both wife and daughter in February 1503 effectively ended the king's active family life and contributed to his increasingly isolated final years. Catherine's death, combined with her mother's, demonstrated the fragility of even royal lives and the unpredictability of dynastic planning. Henry VII had successfully established his dynasty, but personal tragedy reminded him that even kings were subject to forces beyond their control. Katherine Tudor's brief life serves as perhaps the most poignant reminder of the human cost of royal ambition. Born into a world of ceremony and expectation, she lived only long enough to experience the basic biological struggle for survival that faced all infants in her era. Her story illustrates the gap between the grand plans of dynastic politics and the simple realities of human mortality. Despite all the titles, ceremonies, and careful arrangements that surrounded royal births, Katherine Tudor's experience was ultimately no different from that of countless other infants who failed to survive their first months of life. In the context of Henry VII's children, Katherine represents both the hope that attended each royal birth and the sorrow that too often followed them, reminding us that behind the grand narratives of political history lay the intimate dramas of family love and loss. The 7 children of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York tell a story that encompasses the full range of human experience, triumph and tragedy, ambition and loss, success and unfulfilled potential. From Arthur, the heir who died too soon, to Katherine, who barely drew breath, each child played a role in the larger drama of Tudor dynasty building. Of Henry VII's 7 children, only 3 survived to adulthood. Margaret, who became Queen of Scotland and mother to a royal line that would eventually inherit the English throne. Henry, who became Henry VIII and transformed England into a major European power. And Mary, who briefly reigned as Queen of France before finding happiness as Duchess of Suffolk. The other 4, Arthur, Elizabeth, Edmund, and Katherine, died young, victims of the high infant mortality that claimed roughly 1/3 of all children in their era, regardless of social status. Henry VII's children embodied his grand strategy of using marriage alliances to legitimize the Tudor dynasty and secure England's position in Europe. Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon sought Spanish recognition. Margaret's marriage to James IV aimed to neutralize the Scottish threat. Mary's marriages provided both French alliance and, eventually, personal happiness. These marriage alliances reveal Henry VII's understanding that dynastic security required more than military victory. It demanded international recognition and carefully constructed diplomatic relationships. Yet the story of Henry VII's children also reveals the human cost of dynastic ambition. The deaths of Arthur, Elizabeth, Edmund, and Katherine remind us that even the most carefully laid political plans remain subject to forces beyond human control. Each loss was both a personal tragedy for the royal family and a practical setback to Henry VII's long-term strategy. The king's increasing caution and control over his surviving children in his later years reflects his hard-learned understanding of how quickly dynastic hopes could be destroyed by death. Paradoxically, it was through Henry VII's daughter Margaret, initially seen as a diplomatic sacrifice to Scottish interests, that the Tudor vision of British unification was ultimately realized. When her great-grandson, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England in 1603, the 2 kingdoms were finally united under a single crown, fulfilling Henry VII's original dream through an unexpected path. Meanwhile, Henry VIII's reign, shaped by his father's lessons in dynastic vulnerability, would transform England but also demonstrate the dangers of absolute monarchy when wielded by a less cautious ruler. The story of Henry VII's children illustrates several key themes in early modern European history: the importance of marriage diplomacy and international relations, the persistent threat of infant mortality to dynastic planning, and the complex interplay between personal relationships and political necessity in royal families. Their experiences also demonstrate how individual human choices, like Mary's decision to marry for love or Margaret's political maneuvering in Scotland, could have consequences spanning generations and affecting the course of nations. From the eldest heir to the babies laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, the story of Henry VII's children is ultimately the human side of Tudor statecraft. Behind the grand narratives of political transformation lay intimate dramas of parental love, sibling relationships, personal ambition, and individual tragedy. Henry VII had successfully founded a dynasty, but he could not control how his children would live their lives or fulfill their destinies. Some exceeded his expectations, others fell short of their potential, and still others never had the chance to discover what they might have accomplished. Their collective story reminds us that history is made not just by kings and queens, but by the full range of human experience, the children who lived to reshape nations and those who died too young to fulfill their promise, the marriages that created lasting alliances and those that sparked diplomatic crises, the successes that vindicated careful planning and the tragedies that revealed the limits of human control over destiny. In understanding what happened to Henry VII's children, we gain insight not just into Tudor history, but into the eternal human struggle to build lasting legacies while navigating the uncertainties of mortality, ambition, and love.